Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114, where we keep on talking about global economic justice, in particular looking at uh, economic inequality and issues of distributive justice. That is, what should we do with the limited resources we have? What we're doing in this lecture is we're taking a look at two different theories of justice and what they argue we should do as far as approaching and balancing the two different notions of rights that we discussed in the last video. So as far as what we're going to talk about today, we're going to first do our usual recap of a little bit of vocab to make sure that we're all on the same page about that. We're going to dig a little bit into the notion of fairness. We're going to talk about egalitarian theories, some of their common features, and then the theory of John Rawls in particular and his two principles of justice. We're then going to discuss libertarian theories and look at Robert Nozick's libertarian theory and what it says about how to balance rights. And then we'll end with our usual looking ahead to the next lecture and see how this stuff all fits together. So to start off, just as a reminder, because I have no idea how long you guys take in between watching these or doing the work, whether you spread it out over days or usually probably cram it all into one long night on the weekend that old stuff's due. No judgment. I've been there too. But, because I don't know, let's refresh just a little bit on the vocab. So as I just said, we're focusing on economic justice and inequality. That is, we're focusing on distributive justice when we talk about economic justice. And so that means that we're dealing with questions and different aspects of the issue of what constitutes a fair distribution of goods and resources, given the fact that the world has limited resources and crazy amounts of inequality and poverty all around the world. Now, there are two main different theories on how we should approach distributive justice, and these are egalitarian and libertarian theories. Egalitarian theories of justice argue that justice requires an equal distribution of goods and benefits, whereas the libertarians argue that you should emphasize negative rights, and that is, you should emphasize the notion of personal and individual liberties instead of discussing the notion of a positive right or an entitlement to something. And while on its own, the bumper sticker definition there doesn't exactly tell us what we should do about inequality and poverty, the implications of that can be quite strong. Now, the notion of right that these different theories are going to deal with is particularly a right in the sense of a political right or a moral right in our case. And a right is just someone's ability to justifiably make a claim to something, a claim that we morally ought to recognize and fulfill. To have a right to something is to be entitled to that thing, or to be entitled to be free from restrictions on that thing. A negative right is a right that obligates others to not interfere with your obtaining or having something, whereas a positive right is a right that obligates others to help you actually obtain something. Think again of the right to free speech being a right to not have restrictions placed on you, whereas a positive right example would be something like the right to an attorney, something that you're entitled to that others ought to help you achieve or obtain. So, with this stuff in mind, let's talk just a little bit about fairness for a minute. Now, when we talk about justice, when we talk especially about distributive justice, we're talking about what sort of distribution of goods is fair or just, if we want to use the adjective version of justice. That is, we're talking about what people deserve, what people ought to receive, either good or bad. Like in the case of retributive justice, where we're talking about people deserve a certain punishment. And so when we talk about justice, we have to talk about fairness to a certain extent. Now, that's not to say that the notion of justice is the same as the notion of fairness. We can't say that the two concepts are identical, because there are probably some instances where what's fair is not what's just. Or we might say that fairness is a far more basic concept than justness. But regardless of how the two fit together, it does seem pretty clear that justice and fairness are tightly connected in some way. So we can't talk about one without talking about the other. But it also means that if we're going to have legitimate philosophical questions about justice, we can't beg the question and just assume a certain answer to some of these topics, because that sort of thing would be unjustified. We can't just jump to a conclusion without having good reasons and a thorough investigation into what these concepts really are. So we can't just automatically assume that fairness is the same thing as equality. For one, there's the cookie example we used in the last lecture. But there are also a couple of different concepts that tend to be associated with fairness, and they can be radically different things. And these are what we might call equality and equity. Now, equality is probably what we usually think of when we talk about fairness. Equality has to do with treating people the same way, or giving people the same sort of good or benefit, giving people equal measures of something, whether it be treatment, social benefits, resources, etc. Equity, by contrast, is treating people so that they achieve the same result, even if that means that you're treating them differently or unequally. To help illustrate this a little bit, imagine giving out money or something like that. There's that Mega Billions lottery that's happening around, in the neighborhood of when you guys are watching this. It'll be in the past for pretty much everybody. But suppose that we're giving out money. If I were to give the entire class $100, like I just put up a PayPal link that if you clicked it, it would download $100 to your account. However, you might make sense of that sort of thing. If I were to give everyone the same amount of money, if I were to treat people exactly the same way, I'd be treating you equally. But that might not necessarily be fair. There are questions about whether or not that's a fair way to treat the students, or my students. For one, it's incredibly generous. So to say that treating you all fairly might seem a little bit much. I'm treating you guys generously for sure. But if I were to give everyone in the class, all 80-something of you, $100 each, some of you probably need that $100 a lot more than others do. Some of you might be wealthy enough that you barely notice an extra $100. Some of you may be lower on the economic ladder, and $100 could entirely change your month. So, or depending on just individual circumstances, depending on what bills or whatever else have come up, $100 could change a lot for you. So in terms of the result of me giving everybody the exact same thing, it may not actually be fair to do so. So equal treatment isn't necessarily fair treatment. But similarly, the alternative may not be either. There's the distinct concept of treating people equitably, or to treat people with equity rather than equality. And this would be as if I gave everybody enough money to say, whatever amount of money you have in your pockets, I'm going to give you enough money to raise that up to $100. So say if you have $300 in your pocket, I won't give you anything. But if you have no money in your pocket, I'll give you $100. If you have 50, I'd give you 50, and so on. But that way, everybody has $100 in their pocket. This is treating people equitably, or to treat people with equity. That is getting people to the same result rather than giving them the exact same treatment. And in some circumstances, this might be a better candidate for treating people fairly, and others maybe not. This is the sort of thing that takes it a little bit more investigation. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, as I said, we have to talk about fairness to a certain extent when we deal with questions of justice. And when we deal with questions of justice, we have different theories about it. We have different explanations for what justice is and what it demands of us, which things are right and wrong, and why they're right and wrong. And so egalitarian theories of justice, one of our two big candidates for competing explanations for what is just, that is not just a perspective, but a competing explanation. Egalitarian theories say that a just distribution of goods is an equal distribution of goods. That is, people should receive the same things. And so, this is the kind of idea that you hear with phrases like everybody gets one or everybody take one. This is treating people equally. And this is, in some circumstances, a candidate for a fair or a just distribution of goods. And this honestly has a lot of theoretical benefits to it, if we want to parallel to our theoretical costs. This kind of theory of justice, of distributive justice, is straightforward and simple. It's intuitive. It's the sort of thing that just simply seems correct to a lot of people. It's easy to apply, and it doesn't take a lot of arguing to establish that this is not a terrible way of treating people or distributing goods. It's the sort of theory that people default to in many circumstances. Like the everybody gets one, everybody take one. This is the kind of phrase that we use with kids trick-or-treating on Halloween, or it's what we do when we give out things to large crowds. We usually treat people equally. This seems to be one of the most obvious, impartial, objective, and intuitive ways that we can try and fairly distribute goods and benefits. So, it's got a lot going for it as far as a theory of justice goes. It seems to be one of our default theories of justice. However, it might not lead to the outcomes that we want. Treating people differently may actually be the better way to be fair, depending on the circumstances. So, like here on the side of the PowerPoint, we've got this lovely little illustration here. On one side, we have equal treatment, and on the other side, we have unequal, but seemingly far more fair treatment, because based on the circumstances, it seems far better to get people to the same result than it does to give people things they either might not need or not enough of what they do need. So while a strict egalitarian theory, a theory that purely runs off of the notion of equality, while it may be obvious and intuitive and seemingly correct in many circumstances, there may be some situations that treating people equitably will be far better. And this is the kind of idea that's used with the egalitarian theory we're going to look at in particular, that was created by John Rawls. John Rawls was a 20th century philosopher. He just died in 2002, who was one of the few really big names in philosophy from the last century. Like probably 100 years from now, people will still be studying his stuff in the same way that we do the big names from the last couple of centuries. So John Rawls is kind of getting added to the philosophical canon, so to speak. And the contribution that he made that makes him so notable is that he presents an egalitarian theory of justice. And he elaborates on some very old ideas on how society ought to be structured. But he does so focusing on equity rather than strict equality. And he proposes a number of ideas about justice that seem intuitive, quite convincing, and very powerful in the sense of the sorts of explanations that they might allow us to do for different questions of justice and different political questions. And while we only see a very small section of all this, he wrote a massive book, some 4 or 5 inches thick, I think, if you find the main copies of it. But Rawls's theory of justice argued pretty much that societies ought to be concerned with justice in their organization and structure. And he goes through and lays out a set of principles for doing that, for helping societies structure themselves in just ways that were pretty novel for the time and are still widely talked about now. And so Rawls argued, if we go down kind of his main arguments in a couple of steps, Rawls argued that societies should be primarily concerned with justice in their organization and structure. That is, justice is something that all societies should strive for, and that if a society is not just, we ought to reject it in some ways. He makes the analogy in our reading to untrue beliefs or false beliefs. Statements and ideas and things should strive to be true. This is like what it means to be an excellent statement in many ways. And we should reject beliefs or statements or ideas that aren't true. that don't have that sort of excellence to them. So just like we reject untrue beliefs, we should reject unjust societies. It seems rather intuitive and direct. The society should try and be as just as possible in the way that it treats its citizens and the sort of laws that it has and whatever else. And although we're not explicitly talking politics, this does matter quite a lot for distributive justice, because it's mainly society that decides how goods are organized and divided. In fact, terms like economics literally mean things like the management of the home or the management of the goods of a society. What sort of laws and structures should be in place to organize how goods and services flow and move between people? Now, given that, societies are largely built around sets of rules and agreements between people. A very old term called the social contract is one way of talking about this sort of thing. It's somewhat controversial, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on it because this is not a political philosophy class. And we're less concerned with political theory than we are questions of just economic justice in general. But the basic idea of a social contract is that essentially societies are organized around a sort of implicit agreement between all the people that are part of that society. Essentially, in order to be part of a given society, you have to basically agree to follow the rules and sort of give up a certain amount of freedom in order to be a part of the society. You have to agree to the rules of the United States in order to live here. Now, sure, you can break those rules, but you'll be punished for it in the appropriate ways. It's sort of like playing a sport. There's almost an implicit agreement between everybody involved, say in a game of baseball, to follow the rules of baseball. Otherwise, you can't really be part of the game. You just happen to be on the same field at the same time. Now, Rawls takes this notion of a social contract and he abstracts in ways that haven't been done by a lot of folks before. Most political theorists and historians and just most other scholars recognize that there's almost never an actual contract that was signed at some point in history. People don't just get together and say, okay, we're making society today on this date at this point in history. We will henceforth now follow these sets of rules in exchange for these goods and benefits of being part of the society. The United States and sort of our national mythology, we have a little bit of that sort of thing, but honestly, the process of like signing the Constitution or whatever else was far more complicated and drawn out, and there were far more established practices and things that were already incorporated into it that it's really not even the case in our country. And ours is honestly one of the, being a very young country with plenty of documentation of its history, is one of the best opportunities for this to actually happen. So generally, there's no actual social contract or founding moment where everybody gets together and agrees to be part of society. I can almost guarantee that unless you are a naturalized citizen of a given country, you've probably never actually sat down and signed a piece of paper or taken a test or something to see how well or whether you would agree to be part of the rules of the society in order to be a part of it. So it's not something that happens for you. It's not something that happens in history. It's just not something that happens. But that doesn't mean that the idea isn't useful for figuring out how to work with and organize society. Because there is no actual contract, we kind of, if we're going to use this idea to talk about society, because it does seem to accurately describe some part of the way that we relate to each other in societies, we can take that concept and kind of generalize back from it and sort of take a more abstract look at it to consider what sort of rules should be agreed to. Excuse me. In other words, we can take the notion of a social contract and we can step back to a certain degree. We can take a more abstract look at it, Rawls says, and basically ask, what would the social contract be like if there had been a time and place where it was made? And because we're worried about justice, what should that agreement be like? What rules and principles and structures should be the basic framework of society? How should we govern ourselves in order to be as just as possible? What's the moral way to put a society together? Now, to answer this sort of question, to do this kind of abstracting, Rawls proposes a thought experiment. That is, an imaginary situation meant to illustrate a point. He doesn't think this is a real thing, but Rawls proposes a thought experiment to help imagine what a just society actually looks like. And Rawls calls this the original position. So Rawls has us imagine, what would the rules be like if people got together to make society and to make this social contract, this agreement between all of us, before they actually knew what their lives were like? Imagine if they started with nothing, no information, totally abstract, generic people behind what we might call a veil of ignorance. Imagine if people got together to make society before they knew what place they would have in that society. We might wonder, like, what if you didn't know whether you were going to be black or white or straight or gay or man or woman or something else, or whether you would be young or old or whatever else. Imagine you didn't know any details of what sort of life you would have in that society. What sort of rules would you agree to? Rawls thinks that this kind of thinking can actually tell us something about the real society that has all of those little particular details to it. Like, imagine if you and a bunch of other very generic people with no particular details got together. Rawls says we probably would agree to some rules and not agree to others, because we do have to agree. That's what the whole social contract thing's about. We have to sort of make an agreement between each other. Okay, this is how we're going to live. But if you didn't know what sort of person you were going to be, if you didn't know whether you were going to be a man or a woman, for example, if you didn't know whether you were going to be a woman or not, would you put rules in place that discriminate against women? Because you could be one. You might end up that way. And so you probably wouldn't agree to rules that would put you in a far worse position. See, Rawls thinks that even when we generalize and abstract away from all those other particular little details of our lives, he thinks we can still say some pretty substantial things about people. Human beings are basically self-interested, Rawls says. We try and do whatever's best for us, at least before or in addition to whatever else we might work towards. It's not that we're all inherently selfish or something like that, but we definitely worry about self-interest as much or more than we do other things. And we're also all basically rational. That is, we're not, brilliant. We're not run solely by IQ or anything like that. We're not all geniuses. Rawls isn't saying anything like that. Human beings can be wildly irrational. But we can also make some connections. We can still, even when we're in a very abstract, imaginary position, we can clearly see the consequences of some things. So, when we look at possible ways of organizing society, where say, oh, we're going to enslave this group of people, those types of rules probably aren't going to be agreed to because, well, you might end up being part of that group, and that would be bad for you. And you can see that. No matter how abstract and imaginary the position is, we can still draw those sorts of conclusions, and we would probably agree to certain types of societies rather than others. We probably wouldn't agree to slave-holding societies. We probably wouldn't agree to societies that treat people in truly horrendous or inhumane ways, because we might end up in those positions. And while different societies are going to come to different conclusions, there are no universal agreements here. Rawls admits societies are organized wildly differently, even by rational people, just because of where they're at and what their needs are and what the circumstances are. But there are probably two general principles, Rawls says, that would still organize and help determine which rules are okay, which rules aren't. And Rawls thinks that these are two principles that people in this original position, this imaginary thought experiment, would come up with. And the first one, these two principles of justice are basically the guidelines for building a society. And Rawls lays them out, and I've got them here on the side of the screen, but the first one basically states that people should have as many basic negative rights, that is, personal basic liberties, as possible, so long as the list of freedoms doesn't limit or infringe on others. So, like, we should all have as many freedoms as possible, but you can't just freely murder people, because that's going to infringe on other people's right to do things like they want. So a right to murder doesn't really make any sense. Similarly with rights of stealing and that sort of thing. So there are some rights that we can't have because they kind of make the whole system impossible. But Rawls thinks that in general, people would agree to be as free as possible while still living in a constrained, sane society. The second principle says that some inequalities are actually acceptable so long as they benefit everybody. That is, not everybody has to be given the exact same thing. That is, we shouldn't necessarily treat people equally all of the time, 100% of the time. In some circumstances, equitable treatment would be allowed instead. Some inequalities would be allowed if they're good for everyone. So, like, for example, we might consider whether or not people can have vastly different amounts of wealth. And Rawls would say that those kinds of inequalities are permissible, that is, they're just, they're fair, only if they benefit everybody. Because that's the only way that people would agree to them in this original position, is if, well, I don't know whether I'm going to be rich or not, but I'll let you have massive amounts of wealth if it's really going to benefit all of us. If it doesn't, then to hell with that. There should be limits here. We should make sure that everybody's taken care of in some way. There's certain inequalities that are permissible and some that are not, according to Rawls. So Rawls thinks that equity rather than equality should be the guiding ideal for distributions of goods. If it benefits everybody, unequal treatment is permissible because it helps get us all to a better place. If it doesn't, well, then it's not a permissible sort of inequality. Now, it is worth noting, and I think worth stressing, that Rawls does number these two principles of justice for a reason. He thinks that principle one, this idea that people should be as free as possible, is more important than principle two. So if an inequality would make things better for people overall, but it violates basic liberties, it's not okay. Like, imagine if we picked, like, say there's a society of 100 people living on an island, and they go through Rawls's original position sort of thing. They might propose, hey, let's pick 5 people to just be our slaves 100% of the time. They'll just be our slaves forever. The rest of us get to relax. These 5 people are going to work like crazy, but the rest of our lives are going to be pretty good. Rawls would say that's not permissible. That kind of inequality, that kind of unequal treatment violates the basic rights of those 5 people. So even if it benefits the island as a whole, it's not allowed to do that sort of thing. So Rawls does still say that basic liberties and negative rights are still very important. In fact, in some circumstances, more important. But that's not the main point of this theory. And there are a number of objections that can be raised against all this. For one, Rawls's theory of justice, his explanation of how justice works or how we can arrive at justice, may not work very well as an explanation. For one, a lot of people object to the idea that we can actually put ourselves in the original position. Like, a lot of people object and say, human beings can't forget or set aside those kinds of things like, well, I'm a straight white man in this society, or that we can't abstract away from all the particular details of our lives. Those sorts of things are too ingrained in the way that we think and the way that we approach problems. So we can't really use the thought experiment that Rawls comes up with. And even if we can do it, we might not can do so clearly or accurately. We might not actually be able to figure out good, just ways of organizing society or distributing goods. And even if we can do this level of abstraction, it may not be useful in any way. And we might also object just simply to the content of the position. Some people may criticize Rawls's view for allowing unequal treatment. They, for one, just might argue that unequal treatment in general is wrong, but they might also disagree with the fact that for Rawls, positive rights do win over basic liberties in some instances. Positive rights, those allowed permissible inequalities, that may not be the right way of approaching justice. We may need to adopt a more libertarian theory instead. In fact, the fact that Rawls allows for positive rights at all in this sort of position might not be an acceptable thing for many people. Others might say that Rawls doesn't go far enough, that because he does organize his two principles in a priority way, saying that these inequalities can't violate certain basic liberties, this may not go far enough, that it may be better to allow massive inequalities so long as they benefit everybody, that we should give up these sorts of basic liberties to make sure that everybody gets the resources and things that they need. So we might criticize Rawls from a number of different positions, all of them with rational argument behind them. Others may just object to the notion of a social contract in general. There are other traditions and other ways of thinking about political philosophy. But the strongest opponents overall are going to be libertarian theories, like those of Robert Nozick. And libertarian theories are simply going to stress, as we've said before, negative rights and liberties over positive rights. And they're going to do so on a basic conceptual level. Most libertarian theories argue something like, because positive rights say that the person who has them is entitled to something, we're obligated to help them obtain it. That's part of the definition of a positive right. If you have a right to an attorney, the rest of us are obligated to, in some way, even if it's just funding it through tax dollars, we're obligated in some way to help you have legal representation in a court of law. Now, usually, this means that we have to give up something of our own. We have this obligation that we have to fulfill. And so we might have to give up time or energy or resources to help you obtain something. On a far more basic level, take something like, if you have a right to water, suppose that there is such a thing as a right to clean water. If I'm the only one nearby who has water, then morally speaking, if you have that right, I have to give some to you. You're entitled to water that I own. And so most libertarian theories say something like, this is the wrong way to be thinking about obligation and entitlement and even such things as property rights. In order to satisfy your right, if you have one, I have to give up something that I'm entitled to. So in other words, in order to do what's right, in order to fulfill one of my obligations, I have to get rid of something that should be mine. And this seems wrong. I have to violate some of my own negative rights in order to fulfill your positive right. And this seems messed up to a lot of people, including Robert Nozick. Nozick argues that, particularly in the cases of economic justice and distributive justice, that we really should prioritize these negative rights. Nozick starts off with the idea that there are only a few ways that things can be justly distributed. For one, so long as something, call it X, it can be an apple if you want it to be. So long as the thing we're talking about, the apple, was acquired justly and fairly by me, let's say person one, then that person's entitled to it. So long as I get my apple fairly, and I got that apple through just means, I either paid for it fairly or I earned it, I grew it myself. So long as I did something justly and fairly to obtain it, it's mine. I'm entitled to it. This is something that I have a claim on, a real, rational, moral claim. If it's also the case, Nozick thinks, that if I transfer that thing to someone else in a just or fair manner, then they're entitled to it now. So if I've got an apple that I obtained justly and fairly, and then I give it to somebody else in a fair and open and intentional way, something that's nice and fair and just, then it's now theirs, and they have an entitlement to it. And he thinks that this is the only two basic ways that things get moved around in a just or fair manner. Any distribution of goods is only fair if the things involved were either gained through fair methods or they were transferred through fair methods. And so long as that thing was gained or transferred fairly, you're entitled to it. If it wasn't, if it was stolen at some point, or if you gained it through unfair means, then you're not really entitled to it in the way that you would have been. Now, the issue with this, the general idea that this leads to, and Nozick goes through a few more complicated steps, but honestly, for our purposes, we can simply jump to the latter part of his argument. The issue is that when we redistribute goods to try and satisfy positive rights, this is usually through something like taxation or some other method very much like it, where we take, as a society, we take things from places where they're not needed as much and we redistribute them elsewhere. So, like I said, we tax people who do have money and resources in order to pay for the needs of those who don't have them. Now, in this sort of case, that redistribution is not just or fair. Say, if person one acquired X justly, it doesn't make any sense to give it to person two on the basis of person two having a right to that thing. Because having a right to that thing means that you're entitled to it. But it's not the case that person two is entitled to that thing. Remember, you're only entitled to things if you either gained it fairly or transferred it fairly. So if I'm forced to give up something because of a supposed entitlement that you have, that only works if you either acquired it yourself fairly or I transferred it to you. It makes no sense for me to have to give it up. The idea of me being obligated to give it up because you deserve it in some sense, you have a right to it, doesn't make any sense. The basic framework that Nozick starts with rules out that possibility. It denies the possibility of the existence of positive rights. On this kind of framework, which seems intuitive and straightforward, but to a lot of people, positive rights just don't make any sense. There can't be such a thing, because you can't be entitled to something that you didn't acquire fairly and that wasn't transferred to you fairly. So we really shouldn't have any of this notion of positive rights, and we shouldn't look at things like allowing unequal distributions of goods or treating people unequally, where you take from one person and give to another. You shouldn't allow these sorts of things on the basis of, well, they deserve it, they need it, they're morally entitled to it. That sort of explanation doesn't fly, according to Nozick and other libertarians. So it's something to be aware of and mindful of. So, I just noticed that this is not the slide that it should have been. This should be reorganized to talk more about duties of beneficence. But because I am quite a ways into a long lecture, I'm not doing another take of this just for the sake of a few typos. So, next time, what we're going to look at is we're going to investigate more these duties of beneficence. The discussions today have been theories about economic justice and things on a larger scale, ways that we should organize society, and what sort of notions of rights make sense. Rawls argues that positive rights do have a large place to play in our moral thinking, that there are important aspects of basic liberties to respect, but also that Inequalities that benefit others are things that we ought to accept. Unequal treatment is something that we ought to allow so long as it benefits those who are in need. Nozick, by contrast, thinks that that notion just doesn't fit together well, that it's an incoherent sort of view. And these are things that officially, again, I have no position on, but it's food for thought, things for you to consider as we move ahead. So take a look at the other readings, take a look at the first journal if you haven't already, and